This podcast was produced by OAR FM Dunedin with support from New Zealand On Air.
Welcome to Disabled Persons Assembly's Notable Radio Show. DPA is a systemic advocacy organisation run by and for disabled people. DPA is a pan-impaired organisation with members across the country. Over the next half hour, we'll discover how we can work collaboratively to achieve inclusion for all New Zealanders. DPA's Notable Radio Show, a whole new attitude.
Kia ora and welcome to DPA's Notable Radio. I'm your host, Amy Taylor. So this year is an election year. Our general election is held on the 7th of November 2026. Many disabled people are asking important questions about what policies the political parties are offering that will improve the lives of disabled people. Today, we're here to look at some of the key disability issues and the sort of questions you should be asking our politicians and our political parties on their policies in order to make an informed decision about your vote. This program is not to tell you who to vote for. That's absolutely not the purpose of this program. The program is to inform you on the sort of things that might be helpful to think about when questioning your politicians about what they offer and making informed decisions about your vote. So DPA and People First are planning in Dunedin an election forum, and we've got a preliminary date for the 26th of September this year. So that should allow you a little bit of time still to register to vote, with voter registrations closing around the 7th of October. So we should all be enrolled to vote, and we should all be exercising our political rights. So why do elections matter? So when we talk about how many disabled people are in New Zealand, the latest census tells us that it's probably about 17% of New Zealanders are disabled. So we have a significant percentage. So our vote really does count. So when we include family members, whānau carers, disability affects a significant proportion of the population. So we need to remember that our vote does actually matter. And when we vote, we can instigate change. So unfortunately, disability issues are often not present in election debates, and we need to address this. And we can address this by asking questions of the political parties. Government decisions affect every aspect of our lives. They affect things like disability support funding, accessible transport, housing, healthcare, education, employment, income supports, and rights and accessibility. So the decisions that are made after this election will directly affect your life, my life, and disabled people across the country for a number of years. So your vote really does matter, and it's really important that you register for voting and go to the polls. So let's talk about some of the issues that are affecting disabled people, some of the political issues. One of them is disability support services. Now, you will have heard a lot in the media about the Disability Support Services Bill. And submissions have recently closed, so we can no longer submit on this bill, but there will be some oral submissions. The current government says its reforms are intended to make disability support more consistent, transparent and sustainable. However, many disabled people and advocates have expressed concerns about funding restrictions and changes to disability support services and the introduction of the Disability Support Services Bill. So when we talk about the Disability Support Services Bill, remember this is the piece of legislation that the coalition government has put forward that overrides the Supreme Court decision that says that family carers are employees of the state. So it says that family carers are not employees of the state and they are not entitled to worker compensation and other perks associated by being an employee. The Green Party has strongly criticised this legislation, arguing that disabled people were not adequately consulted and the principle of nothing about us without us has not been respected. The Labour Party has also come out in criticism of this piece of legislation. So we need to talk about what we do actually want from our political parties when we are considering disability support services. And some of the questions you could ask are, will the funding keep pace with demand? Will disabled people have genuine choice and control over their care and support? Will carers be paid adequately and their work be acknowledged? And will they be supported? What role will disabled people have in decision-makings about disability support services? So connected to this is the issue of family carers. So the Disability Support Services Bill, as I've said before, puts forward the notion that care is actually the primary responsibility of the family. It is not the primary responsibility of the state, and the state should only step in when the family no longer has capacity for care. Now, this has been disputed by a number of disability advocates in saying that this puts extra pressure on family carers. It doesn't give disabled people autonomy over their care. So across New Zealand, thousands of family members provide essential care and support. Many have given up their careers, so they can't work in typical paid employment because they are caring for disabled family members, or they've had to reduce their working hours. And this can lead to financial hardship. So there's been a number of recent debates about carer rights and their employment status, and surrounding the Disability Support Services Bill. So when you consider family carers, some of the questions that you might ask the political parties is, how will family carers be recognised? Will they receive adequate financial support? How will the government address poverty in family carer communities? And what support will be available for ageing carers? And then we need to talk about things like residential care and how that will be available for disabled people. So keep in mind some of these questions for when we have our election forum. What could we ask our political candidates about their party's policies? And then now let's talk about transport. Accessible transport remains one of the most important issues for disabled people. So we've had, this coalition government has put in place some recent changes to total mobility subsidies, cuts to total mobility subsidies that have raised concerns among disabled people and advocacy groups. For some people, transport is the difference between participation and isolation. Without affordable transport, people might not be able to attend medical appointments, work or study, volunteer, visit family and friends, and participate in community life. So Labour has recently announced a subsidised transport policy with public transport caps being public transport being capped at $10 a week and $20 in major centres. On the surface, this seems like a great policy for getting people out of their cars and onto public transport. Unfortunately, many disabled people cannot use standard public transport, which is why the Total Mobility Scheme exists in the first place. Unfortunately, Labour has made no mention of repealing the changes to total mobility. So we really need to be asking our political parties, what are they going to be doing with total mobility? How are they going to support transport for disabled people? There's also the issue of rural communities. There is very limited public transport available in rural communities. So the policy is skewed to advantaging those that live in commercial centres. Voters may want to ask candidates, do you support expanding the total mobility scheme? How will you improve access to public transport? And remember, access doesn't just mean a ramp. Access is a far more universal concept. So access can include public transport in rural areas. Access can include things like making sure that the pathways and footpaths are clear, making sure that bus stops are in areas near people's homes. What investment will be made to rural public transport? And how can we keep public transport affordable? And then there is the issue of housing. Accessible housing remains in critically short supply. As I've mentioned on this show before, Kāinga Ora has abandoned their goal to build 15% universally designed houses. And this is a huge blow to the disabled community and will put extra pressure on disabled people to find accessible housing. And when we don't have any accessible social housing, people with disabilities that are in a low socioeconomic position are really in trouble. So abandoning this goal to build accessible housing is something that is of a huge concern to disabled community. Many disabled people face long waiting lists, inaccessible rentals, and homes that are expensive to modify. Renting and owning a home in New Zealand is expensive as it is for typical people. People with disabilities face additional barriers in the housing. Newly released New Zealand Disability Strategy, the newly released Disability Strategy identifies housing as one of the key areas for government action. So it's really disappointing to see that this goal has been abandoned. So when we are talking to our political candidates, we need to be asking questions like, how many accessible housing will be built? How will universal standards of design be strengthened and used in building these houses? Will housing affordability improve for disabled people? And what support is available for housing modifications for disabled people? We need to really be looking at making sure our disabled community is adequately housed in healthy homes that meet their needs. So in terms of employment, which is another major political issue that affects the disabled community, disabled people continue to experience significantly lower employment rates than the general population. I've just received a text from a member of the deaf community telling me that they experience barriers in terms of getting employment with people using the health and safety legislation as an excuse to not employ them. And this is the sort of the barriers that disabled people experience on a day-to-day basis when competing in the job market. The coalition government has an approach to disabled people's employment which prioritises welfare to work measures, including tighter work obligations and benefit sanctions, alongside targeted employment support. Many critics argue that the continued use of minimum wage exemptions for some disabled people and increased pressure on benefit recipients creates additional barriers for disabled people accessing employment rather than addressing the systemic challenges disabled people face in finding and maintaining employment. Barriers that the disabled community experience in terms of finding employment include discrimination, lack of accessible workplaces, limited transport options, and lack of workplace accommodations. So many employers will tell you that it is just too expensive to employ disabled people. Now, this is a political issue and something that we need our political parties to be addressing. Many parties will talk about increasing workforce participation, but we need to really be asking, how does this look in practice, and actually is this disability rights informed? So how will employers be encouraged to hire disabled people? What support will be available for workplace accommodations? Will benefit rules support people who want to work? Will they overturn the Minimum Wage Exemption Act? So bear these questions in mind when you are talking to political candidates if employment is a priority issue for you. Then we move on to talking about healthcare. Healthcare remains a significant concern. You will have seen in the media there's been a recent report on healthcare by the Health and Disability Commissioner indicating that healthcare remains inaccessible and inadequate to meet the needs of disabled people, with disabled people experiencing poor health outcomes across the board. Some of the things that disabled people report when accessing healthcare is long wait times, inaccessible services, difficulty in accessing specialists, rejection from referrals, and higher healthcare costs than typical population. Many voters might want to ask questions like, how will healthcare become more accessible? How will healthcare become more disability rights informed? Will waiting lists be reduced? What support will be available for disabled people with complex conditions? How can we support people in their primary care environment to have continuation of care? So these are some of the questions you might want to bear in mind when you're talking about healthcare and talking to our politicians about what policies they plan to offer. Then we need to talk about accessibility. So our previous Labour government floated an accessibility bill. The disabled community came out in full force to argue strongly against this bill in the form that it was presented. The argument was that the bill had no teeth. It was advisory, not compulsory. And ultimately, Labour decided not to pursue this bill. Many disabled advocates would like to see strong, enforceable accessibility legislation that protects the rights of disabled people to access, something maybe loosely modelled on the Americans with Disabilities Act. Remember, accessibility affects every part of life. It includes things like buildings, websites, public information, events, voting processes, and public transport. So the Greens Party's disability policy calls for full implementation of the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disability with strong accessibility measures across society. Other parties have also emphasised improving service delivery, consistency and practical outcomes for disabled people. It doesn't really help to ask candidates whether they support accessibility. They're all going to say, yes, we do. However, we need to see how this is actually going to be practically put in place. So let's talk about some questions that you might want to ask our political candidates. You might want to ask, what is their disability policy? You might want to ask, would you support strong, enforceable accessibility legislation, perhaps loosely based on the Americans with Disabilities Act? Would you actually make sure that whatever we do put in place is not just advisory, that it actually, there are consequences for organisations and businesses that don't actually follow the rules? Because that is what disabled people are saying they actually need. They don't simply need more advisory roles. There are lots of advisory roles. We often find ourselves talking until we're blue in the face about what we need in terms of accessibility. What we need now is some enforceability. So I'm not here to tell you who to vote for. I'm here to tell you what questions you should be asking the political parties that you might consider voting for in terms of their policies. Most political parties don't yet have firm disability policies outlined. So I can't tell you yet what the party's policies around disability are. However, hopefully over the coming months that will become more clear, and we'll be able to target our questions to the political parties around their policies. Although, regardless of that, there are still some key areas that we have outlined that is really important that parties have key disability policies around and that we understand them before we cast our vote. So policies on transport, housing, healthcare, disability supports and carers will affect thousands of lives, including my life and your life. So bear these important aspects in mind when you are casting your vote. It's also important that you enroll to vote. If you don't enroll to vote, you will not be able to vote in this general election. Something like, I think it's the 7th of October. If you haven't registered to vote before the 7th of October, you will only be able to vote by special vote. This year, there's been a change in enrollment process, so you need to enroll early. Read your party policies, attend the candidate meetings. As I said, DPA and People First will be hosting one. I just had a meeting with Leanne from People First this morning to discuss this, and we will be hosting our meeting at the Blind Low Vision Hall on the 26th of September. Ask your questions, share your experiences. Political parties can be informed by lived experience. Make sure your vote is heard by going to the polls this year. Make a difference, cast your vote. Thank you for joining us. This has been DPA's Notable Radio. I'm Amy Taylor. Ka kito e noe.
Disabled Persons Assembly is Aotearoa, New Zealand's first pan-disability national organisation, providing system-level advocacy for all disabled people. Membership is free for individuals. If you'd like to know more, visit our national website at www.dpa.org.nz or contact your local kaituitui or community connector, Amy Taylor, at kaituitui.otipoti@dpa.org.nz. Disabled Persons Assembly, a whole new attitude.
This podcast was produced by OAR FM Dunedin with support from New Zealand On the Air.